Yeah, I know most of you know me, but I'm Ken Marra. I'm in the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup in the policy group in Boston, working with Liz. Mostly, you might know me from LNAPL years, but I've been working on this since Tom Potter left a few months ago. And I presented this to the Environmental Business Council last month, and it prompted a lot of discussion and a lot of interest. And we've added it to our work for the LSPA Technical Practices Subcommittee on Climate Change. Just so you know, don't be disappointed because it's not going to answer as many questions as it prompts. It'll prompt way more questions than we can answer, but it is a good discussion, and it's important to go through. The first thing I'm going to do is focus what the regulatory approach to climate impacts at disposal sites means just in the overall context of climate change. Climate change means many things to many different people, and the important thing is to focus it here for what it means as far as specifically as far as the MCP changes, which were in draft in 2019 and which should be finalized sometime this calendar year. They prompt a lot of questions. The changes themselves aren't that many words, but they are significant. And there's some key questions and issues, as you know, that need to be resolved. There's a number of tools and resources that are out there that are continuously being improved and updated. There's a number of things that are worth looking at that we need to consider. And these are helpful for us to all take a peek at. And then the next steps, which ultimately the final step would be a Q&A or some sort of brief guidance on exactly how it is that we're going to implement this once the regs go final. So first of all, as far as climate change goes, I don't know about you guys, but when someone mentions the word climate change to me, this is kind of what my brain looks like. It means many things: green, sustainable, resilient, clean energy, global warming. I mean, it means lots of this stuff. So to focus it for today and for this discussion, I found a useful way to do it is just to look at the two ways to deal with it. The first way is to reduce it, and the second way is to adapt to it. The reduction is the greenhouse gas emissions, clean energy, green energy, those types of things. That's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is adapting to it. And the key words are resilience and vulnerability, and those are the specific standards that are in the MCP changes that we're going to be looking at. How did we get here? The reason I put this slide in is because when I first started looking at this and going through the public comments and talking to people, one of the comments, a common comment was, you know, why are we trying to regulate climate change in the MCP? It's impossible, it's unpredictable, it's variable. I mean, this makes no sense to even try and do this. Well, the reason we're doing it briefly is because we've been ordered to do it. Going back to 2008, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed, and that set emission reductions targets. And then a period of time passed of 8 years, and lots of things happened. We changed governors, there was some litigation, I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But then finally in 2016, Governor Baker signed Executive Order 569, which refined these emission reduction targets, but also for the first time added these magic words: assess vulnerability and increase resilience. So there it is, it's in the order for the whole Commonwealth, not just DEP and not just the MCP, but here's the order: assess vulnerability and increase resilience. Following that, in 2017, the state created the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP program, which provides financial and technical support for cities and towns. Along the way, there was a huge influx of money. There was a $2.4 billion environmental bond bill that passed, that was issued here, that supports programs like these, and hundreds of millions of dollars has been directed to climate adaptation and resilience. In 2018, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs issued the Master Plan. It's the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, and that's the master roadmap for all things related to climate resilience and science in the Commonwealth. It applies to all the agencies under the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, not just DEP, but all the agencies. And one of the directives to all the agencies was to review their regulations and revise them accordingly. for how they would fit with these resiliency and vulnerability orders. Within these measures that were specified out in the plan, there's a number of assignments for DEP, 7 or 8 or 9 of them, I think. There's one in particular that's focused just on 21E, and that's where we're at today. And that's where it specifically calls out assessing the vulnerability of hazardous waste sites in Massachusetts. So that's how we got to where we're at with the draft amendments specific to 21E as directed by EOEEA, as following the governor's order in 2016. The reg changes themselves, like I said, they're not very long, but the words are meaningful and significant. The goal was to identify and assess climate impacts that may affect the permanency and protectiveness of the cleanup, and secondly, to take reasonable measures to reduce these vulnerabilities. And it affects the MCP in 3 places. The first is in the conceptual site model, the second is in RAPS, and then finally, later on, defining the foreseeable period of time for a permanent solution, which lots of people have questions on, of course. Here's the conceptual site model change. It's just now that it provides a dynamic framework for assessing current and foreseeable future site characteristics and risk, and that current and foreseeable future is in response to assessing future vulnerability due to climate change. Here's RAPS. The first piece talks about this foreseeable period of time and references it later. I'll get to that in a minute. But the second piece of RAPS is key, and this is the consideration of relevant policies and guidelines issued by the department, EPA, and now officially EOEEA. They are the lead agency. They've given us our technical orders and direction to do what we're doing to integrate resilience and vulnerability evaluation into the MCP. And then the second big piece is the use of accurate, up-to-date methods, standards, practices, equipment, and it specifically calls out the word models. There's lots of, some of you are familiar with some of these. There's lots of climate models and forecasts out there. They're continuously being improved and updated, and now it's part of RAPS, that just as we would do everything else with the most up-to-date methods and practices, and that now officially includes modeling and climate modeling. Defining the foreseeable period of time for purposes of permanent solution. The permanent solution now specifies protection of health, safety, public welfare, and the environment during any foreseeable period of time, considering existing site conditions and reasonably foreseeable future changes in site conditions, including anticipated impacts associated with climate change. So there it is. It's codified in the MCP, as we've been ordered to do, that we've regulated and we've specified climate change considerations into the protectiveness of a permanent solution. So that's pretty much crystal clear, right? Well, the first question that begs is, what time frame applies to reasonably foreseeable future? It's not explicit in the MCP at all, and that's one of the purposes of our work group or the TPC subcommittee, and hopefully the purpose of the Q&A will help clarify what reasonably foreseeable future means. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then the second major question is, what exactly is a 21E site vulnerability assessment? I mean, what's expected, what goes into it, and what would we expect to be done in a vulnerability assessment? And then the third big topical question is, which climate forecasts or models should be used? And I put the word forecast in here in addition to models because there is a subtle difference. I mean, models, those of you who are familiar with them, they're highly numerical, complicated, and require expertise to run them. One answer I think we can safely say today is the expectation is we're not expecting people to do their own setup and calibrate and run their own models. But I do think we would be expecting people to be familiar with what models are out there and what the latest and the most accurate and up-to-date ones are, because they generate these forecasts, and the forecasts are what we are looking at for exposure, and I'll show more of that in a minute. As far as vulnerability and assessing it, it consists of a combination of exposure and sensitivity. The exposure is these models and these forecasts. What are the weather events and climate events that we would be exposed to, and overlaid on top of that would be the sensitivity, like a particular site, how sensitive that site would be to that exposure. And with the exposure, the big four in the state plan are precipitation, sea level, temperature, and extreme weather. And the plan breaks that into about 13 or 14 different sub-hazard categories, like storm surges and inland flooding and coastal flooding and those types of things, and droughts and all sorts of stuff. And but one of the scenarios for what an exposure map might look like, and this is an example from resilientma.org, which is the official state clearinghouse of all data related to climate change. But don't get too much into the details here. This is just an illustration of the layers I chose were, excuse me, projected total precipitation. That's the purple-blue shading around the outside. And then hurricane storage inundation zone, hurricane surge zone inundation areas, which is indicated by the splotchy colors. So that's an example of an exposure scenario. On the other side of the equation is sensitivity, and that's where we would take like our site-specific characteristics for 21E sites. And it's not just the location where they would be located relative to these exposures, but also where they're located relative to other environmental receptors, environmentally sensitive areas, demographics, is it an environmental justice community? It would also consider equipment and structures, not just the remediation equipment on site, but even in the immediate near proximity, bridges and culverts and power lines and railroad tracks and those types of things. And then the last two pieces is where it gets really specific. It would get really specific to us. Regulatory status or remediation status would include things like, is it an open site or a closed site? Is it active? Is there active remediation going on? Does it have an AUL? Does it have an engineered barrier? Is there an EPM? I mean, those types of things would be things that would be considered different levels of sensitivity depending what status they are in. And then the last one is a biggie, and I envision most of our brain cells will be spent looking at this one, and that's contaminant type, fate, and transport. That's complicated enough just dealing with it in the present, but translating it into the future is a challenge, and because different contaminants will behave differently in the environment, as we know, and especially over time. And the concern is, will they get remobilized and become more of a risk due to climate change? And it's not just risk due to increased precipitation, but it could be, the Vado zone could actually get bigger for drought conditions. So lots of factors go into that. Groundwater level changes go into that. I mean, there's lots of things that go into that we'll be talking about. So once you overlay these sensitivity parameters onto an exposure map, a result might look something like this. And this is from the SURF, the Sustainable Remediation Forums. You may have seen this from Tom's work a couple of years ago. But what they did is they screened all the 21E sites, and they identified 6,000 of them based on remediation status or regulatory status, open sites, EPMs, potential imminent hazards, those types of things. And then they overlaid them onto the FEMA NOAA flood maps, which aren't as sophisticated as some of the other newer maps, which I'll go talk more about in a minute, but it gives it an example of the process of assessing vulnerability. Once they overlaid them, they did some calculations and scored different layers, different levels of vulnerability from low to high. Obviously, to look at a specific site, the scale would have to be blown way up in a lot more detail. And the immediate close proximity structures would have to be taken into account. But this is a good approach for how to come up with vulnerability, a combination of sensitivity parameters on top of the exposure forecast that the model would tell you would exist. As far as tools and resources, these are all live hyperlinks. So if I'll share my slides and you can use this as a resource, but the primary one, the one identified by EOEEA and the governor, is the state climate change clearinghouse, or resilientma.org. And if you haven't clicked around in it yet, I highly recommend you do, because I think whichever direction we're going to go, all roads are going to lead to this website and this body of work. The technical lead on it is the Northeast Climate Adaptation Center at UMass Amherst. They've gone through and they've looked at all these sorts of models and vetted them and put them into those layers that I showed you an example of a minute ago. There's currently no 21E sites layer in there, unfortunately. Hopefully there will be. That's one of the things on our to-do list, is to look at that, because if we're supposed to be using these resources and this site to assess vulnerability in the Commonwealth, it should have a 21E sites layer in there. But it does link to everything. It links to the state plan, it links to the MVP program, and it links to all those interactive maps where you can choose all the layers in terms of different types of climate events and exposures. Second state resource is the Mass Office of Technology, Technical Assistance in Technology, or OTA. They have a similar set of maps that overlays different climates, different receptor sensitivities onto exposures. They do have a layer with 21E sites, but they don't have any other sensitivity parameters on it, but they do at least have the locations on it. Another really good example is the MassDEP Federal Highway pilot project report that they did for the Central Artery back in 2015. Some of you may have seen this webinar. This was a couple months ago. They presented to the LSPA. And what they did is they used the more advanced modeling pieces, which they refer to it as probabilistic hydrodynamic modeling. And these are the two of the main models that they used. But these things are based on actual future forecasts. The old FEMA NOAA models, the traditional models that most people are familiar with, are based on historical statistics of imagine a bathtub filling up. You know, the level just keeps linearly filling up, and they take those historical levels, how they've changed, and they project them into the future. So the FEMA NOAA maps are historical based, but these probabilistic hydrodynamic models are future based, and they do predict changes in climates and increased storm surges and hurricanes and all those types of things. The SURF report used the FEMA NOAA maps, which aren't as updated as these exposure maps are, but they did use the sensitivity parameters, some of the sensitivity parameters. They used regulatory status, remediation status. They did not use contaminant type, fate, and transport. So I always thought, you know, a cool thing might be to do is to sort of redo this project, or take this approach with the new models and adding in all the sensitivity parameters for 21E sites, including contaminant, fate, type, and transport. Another huge resource, as usual, is the ITRC. They had the old green and sustainable team. Now it's the sustainable resilient team. Lots of information in this draft document that's under review right now. We've reviewed it and commented on it, and it should be final later this year. But it includes things like best management practices for lots of ideas and how best to adapt to some of the climate events that would be predicted. EPA, of course, has lots of resources on their Superfund webpage, lots of information on vulnerability assessments, resilience measures, and adaptive capacities. And then the last one I listed here is really cool. This is from the I keep saying philanthropic side, but the nonprofit side. The First Street Foundation, with huge money behind them, I'm sure, put together 80 of the world's leading researchers and hydrologists with universities all over the world, and they use the most sophisticated, comprehensive combination of models I've seen so far, and they've came up with literally a property by property map of the whole country. So you could put in your house in Iowa City, and it'll blow it up and show you your forecast, your flood forecast predictions over the next 30 to 50 years. So that's something that's really powerful. It's something obviously insurance companies are very interested in. It's something that I think for us at a particular 21E site could use. And that's definitely something I think hopefully will find its way into Resilient MA as a resource we can all use. So next steps, the first one is to finalize the MCP amendments, which should be in this calendar year in 2020. The LSPA Technical Practices Climate Change Subcommittee, we've met a couple times and we've engaged ourselves into this topic. That's one of the reasons we're doing this presentation today, is to solicit your questions. I'd like to engage with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Center at UMass Amherst, because since they are the technical lead on all things that go into the clearinghouse, they're the ones that have all the information on all the models that we would be using. So it'd be good to make sure we're all on the same page. This also means engaging with the other bureaus. The other DEP bureaus are looking at the same types of things for their own purposes. So it'd be good to compare notes so that everybody's using the same set of climate forecasts. And then the ITRC team, like I said, is still in full swing, and the draft guidance document will be final later this year. And our ultimate goal here is to come up around the time that those regs go final, is to have some sort of at least a good enough Q&A or brief guidance paper that would answer primarily those three questions. You know, what does reasonable and foreseeable future mean? How do you exactly assess vulnerability and what's expected? And which models and forecasts do we expect people to use? So I'm going to stop there. And this for questions. The subcommittee created their own email address, and that's a good place to send any questions you have. You can also send them to me, but that will get to the whole committee, and we are collecting them. Like I said, to have a Q&A, we have to identify all the Qs first, and that's what we're trying to do here. So I'll stop there, and we can take some questions.
Okay, and any questions for Ken?
Will this presentation be available?
Yes. Right?
Yes, the presentation will be, we've just recorded it, as you know, this entire meeting is being recorded, and we'll take it, pull it out and post it separately, in addition to, of course, the meeting video that will be on YouTube. So it will be out there in at least a couple different forms.
Would this be in the advisory committee website link?
We can put the link there as well. It will be on DEP's YouTube channel.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think it'll probably be updated, needless to say, as time goes on and we start getting better clarity on what direction some of these questions are headed.
Mm-hmm. So,
this is Matt. And to Ken, so your slide that showed the RAP's proposed change language, which I believe added models in with, you maybe want to think about that carefully. I remember, Paul, some presentation or some discussion with regard to, in the case of vapor intrusion, the use of models as opposed to data and the department's position. So I don't know if that would change that, but I mean, models would apply widely to things other than climate change. I'm just
absolutely.
And if that's not your intent, then maybe you want to think about that language.
Matt, I think that's addressed in separate sections in the risk characterization section. That language on limitations of use of models is in there.
Okay.
So I think we're generally always in support of using, you know, the best up-to-date models, and then the limitations are expressed other places.
Thank you.
And I think we had a comment the other day on that, the fact that the word model is in the MCP is scared some people. And it's because then you're right to the part where you're afraid, oh, we're gonna have to do our own modeling. And it's like, no. The idea is that the models create the forecasts that are what we're gonna be using, but at least to be using the forecasts that are based on the most up-to-date models is something that, you know, that would be in the Q&A.
No, and I appreciate it, and thank you for clarifying, Ken, and thank you. I just checked my house on flood factor, and I'm at the lowest risk. Thank you very much. But I mean, it really is an amazing site. So it's now flood factor from that last reference you mentioned.
Yeah, First Street.
Put in your house, and bam, there you are on the satellite view, and there's your risk.
Yeah, for floods. Yeah.
For floods.
Yeah.
There are other things. There are fires in California.
Yeah, one of the questions that one of the big questions too that to add to this is this whole business with groundwater fluctuations and the impact on groundwater levels with climate. And that's something that hasn't really been, I haven't seen a lot of references on that. As far as some of the other types of exposure scenarios. It's funny, Larry Feldman sent me his paper from when he was, his thesis, and it's from the USGS, and they have an amazing website, as it turns out now, where they use all these monitoring wells all over the country, but all over Massachusetts, where there's decades of groundwater data that we might want to take a look at. But I had to mention Larry because his paper he sent me, the first name on the paper is James Watt. Remember that guy from the Secretary of Interior? So if it's from James Watt and Ronald Reagan, it has to be good.
Surprised we still have an interior left.
Yeah. But that's a topic. Groundwater is something that I think we need to, that's going to be a tough one for us to come up with something simple but helpful.
Is ITRC addressing the groundwater issue as well?
Not as much. I reviewed the document, and that's one of my first comments is that I said that I think it would help a lot if they really dug into groundwater. They mention it, and they do mention a couple of the things that could be impacted by changing groundwater, but they don't really talk about actual groundwater predictions. But yeah, they do have like a bullet pointed list of the things to think about if groundwater levels change, not just vadose zone decreasing, but also vadose zone increasing for droughts.
And so you've pointed out, and I'm going to do what Matt did after we get off this call and go check my house, which I'm pretty confident in. And those resources seem to be there and easy to access for the question of flood. And
Right.
kind of the question, and if my house were a 21 E site, which to my knowledge it's not, but if it were, then that question of kind of choosing what time period I would look out, and there are some choices there, but those resources should give a good sense of, is this property kind of vulnerable to increased flooding in the future? And you can quibble about kind of what time period you want to look at, but that seems relatively easy to answer given the resources that we have available to us now. And then it's a matter of, okay, what contamination is here? What am I proposing to do with it? If I'm going to, cap it, in an elevated state that might, lead to erosion if flooding would increase, well, that's something relatively straightforward to deal with. But the questions of, are there or will there be resources available to do the similar kind of quick analysis for groundwater fluctuation and drought,
Exactly.
and then groundwater fluctuation, and then so that at least if you're in an area that might be subject to drought, and thus the implication would be that that would also come with lower groundwater levels, and then what does that mean for your site?
Exactly, and that's what I'm hoping they're gonna. We'll get some help from ITRC on that question as well, but the subcommittee is probably going to need to look at that and play around with the USGS data. Matt, have you looked at the USGS website and looked at all those wells? Matt Hackman, you there? Matt?
Yes, I have. I actually used that, not I'm afraid on the Massachusetts site, but on a site in Connecticut. And one of the requirements in Connecticut is, for certain sites, is determining the seasonal high and seasonal low groundwaters. And using the USGS maps was able to show that while the historic data showed a certain seasonal high and seasonal low groundwater due to the drought that was going on, that it was now changed actually. So
right,
it was helpful.
Yeah, I messed around with it briefly the other day, and I just picked a couple random wells and scatter plotted it, and there's no trend that I could see that was obvious. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low.
Well, on this site, the question came, I think it was like back in 2003, 4, 5 or something, there was sort of a sustained drought, and it was comparing historical, that we had like 20 years of data for this gas station site. And so but it sort of played into the conversation that started last week, which was the appearance of NAPL at sites where groundwater has dropped significantly.
Yeah.
And it's no longer hydrostatically held in formation.
Correct.
So.
And you know, that I was been thinking about that we've talked about fluctuating groundwater in LNAPL quite a bit. We just haven't really framed it in terms of fluctuating groundwater due to climate change. But I mean, if there's a smear zone, the smear zone by definition is fluctuating groundwater. We may be looking at situations where it fluctuates more than we thought or drops more than we thought. But the impact, I don't know. That's something we need to think about on the committee, but yes.
I will say that, you know, in terms of sea level rise, the field person was quite excited when they came back from gauging out at that site in Chelsea, the former Chelsea Amoco terminal on Chelsea Creek, when they went out at high tide and pulled the plug on one of the wells and oil shot out about 6 inches up above the top of casing.
Yeah.
Because it was under hydrostatic pressure from the high tide. It was like a moon high tide, super high tide. And
yeah, absolutely.
it happened to be. So you could see that could happen at sites. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a few of them that we've heard of where that's happening for sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's happening today, much less, 50 years from now.
So, well, hydrostatically blocking things like LNAPL, just on the one LNAPL issue, the idea that, rising water levels in coastal communities associated with sea level rise could cause NAPL levels to rise as well. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Including the surface. So that could be another issue.
Yeah. Yeah, because once it hits the surface, it's no longer a stable.
Right.
You've lost your stability, so you've lost your permanent solution.
Yeah.
As we know.
Not to mention the oil all over the place.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
At least then it's obvious.
Well, I won't get into the site I'm thinking of, but yeah, people argue that point.
Any other questions for Ken?
Is there any envisioning of how we would address changes in projected sea levels, as the models change? I mean, over in 10 years, I would expect that these predictions would be different than they are now.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that these new probabilistic hydrodynamic models are pretty good. I mean, if you look at the First Street Foundation one, that uses like that combination of models, they compare it to how the results for what they did is different than using the old FEMA NOAA maps. And I think they said they've got like 70% more vulnerable sites using the new predictive models than the FEMA NOAA maps would have predicted. Now, whether that changes again in 10 years, yeah, it could, but at least now they're looking at future forecasting. They're not using backcasting statistical history.
But I think I would stress that from a regulatory point of view, to the extent that we would be looking, using this data, looking at sites and trying to, look out some number of years. Yes, the predictions may change. 10 years from now, there may be different predictions than there are now, but the expectations are that, right now, when we're doing the work, evaluating these sites, that we should be using the best data that's available now. And, we can look at it and see what today's data and today's model will say about 10, 20, 30 years from now. But we're not asking anybody to figure out what the models will look like and what the best models in 2030 are going to look like. We're, as with anything, we're using the available information that's here today to look at current and future risks.
Yeah, and one thing that is here today is the use of these newer models. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, and I think it is important for Massachusetts to kind of identify, kind of along with ITRC and other states and EPA, kind of what the consensus is of the best, the good, the appropriate models to use today if you're doing this work.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully they'll end up in resilient MA.
Yeah, one of the NAOP comments on the regs was, it's nice to say best available model. It would be nice to have the state say, here are the models you can use, rather than have everybody
Yes.
set themselves up for being sued because somebody argues they didn't use the best available model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I'm hoping that everything that we think is good is going to end up in resilient MA, because that would make it easy. Just say
Right.
if it's in resilient MA, we're good to go.
Yep.
Yeah, but I do think there is an obligation for us to point you in the right direction, rather than, we also don't want to be in the situation where if 50 LSPs got to do their own independent evaluation of what models are good and come up with 50 different models. That's unworkable for us as well.
Right.
So we will try to point to models that we think would be good and appropriate, while leaving, and I have to say this, leaving enough flexibility so if an LSP believes that for their particular purpose that this different model might be better, there will also be, as always, that flexibility to make that make that case.
Yeah.
Right. 80-20 rule.
So a couple of things, sort of the counterpart to the the governor's executive order and the state program is that municipalities got grants to develop MVPs, their municipal vulnerability planning. So that's also sort of a resource to consider. Look at the municipality that your sites are in, and what if that location has an MVP in place. Some of that work may already be done for you, because the municipality itself may have already looked at what the forecast is using the resilientmass.org models. So
Do you think those will, I'm sorry, Paul, do you think those will trump the state models, the resilient mass?
well, they should be. I mean, the MVPs are created by the municipalities using resilientmass.org. So
Yeah, it
as
should be
long
the
as they're
same.
relatively recent, they should be the same.
Yeah, I'm on my town's MVP group, and we use the same clearinghouse, resilientmass.org.
Yeah.
That's one of the designs of the whole program, that people use common vetted information.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
realistically, municipalities aren't going to have the money or expertise to kind of go a completely different way.
Right.
But that's a great suggestion, Marilyn. That's a good resource, and there are many towns that have already done that, at least that first phase.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions or suggestions? This will make this video available to everybody. There will be links up.
I have one comment. Was one of the questions that came up last time, which is a good one, is the concern is this business with reopeners. Like, when at some point we're going to have to specify what would actually reopen a site. Like, Elm apple bubbling out at the surface would invalidate a permanent solution, obviously. But at what point would the risk of remobilization of anything else potentially reopen a site? That seemed, a lot of people brought that up last time. That's why I'm bringing it up here, just to throw that out there. I don't have an answer for that, but people were worried about it. And the other thing was that AULs, are forever. And how does that play with a future climate forecast that only goes for 30 or 50 years? So just throwing the two of the random questions we got last time we did this.
Yeah.
So no need to ask them now.
Hey, Ken, it's Diane Phillips. Yeah, I had raised those concerns from a real estate title issue, as if the AUL describes, and this is hypothetical, but describes the need to reevaluate something, maybe due to climate, in order to, maintain known significant risk or something like that. But if there is a title document, which is the AUL, that includes some uncertainty about what the future requires, that creates, you know, title concerns or title defects that can impact, you know, future real estate transactions. And that's why I kind of was, you know, that's a sort of a legal issue that's slightly different than, you know, all these technical issues as well. So that's something to keep in the back of the mind. I don't know the answer to it, obviously, but that's why I raised some of those sorts of issues.
Yeah.
And you know, for me, AULs have always, you know, served a couple of different purposes. One, if there's specific kind of technical requirements that, you know, apply to a site, it's a way of conveying that. But I've always felt that the most important role an AUL plays is that it provides notice that there's residual contamination left on the property. And regardless of what the additional technical specifications are in there, it's letting, you know, potential future buyers or owners know that, you know, there is some contamination there. It shouldn't pose a risk as long as the, you know, the conditions are such that it doesn't create a new exposure, but it lets people know that there is something there. And, you know, there will always be kind of an obligation to kind of have it in the back of your mind that there's a contamination there. If something dramatic, if your property starts, you know, flooding and eroding, then that's one of the pieces of information that you have because it was on the deed. Okay. Well, one question related to this, and it's a video editing question. Definitely, I'm going to you know, post Ken's presentation as presented on YouTube as a separate thing. Question: what do you think about adding, you know, including the Q&A afterwards as part of that main presentation, or just leave that for the recording of this meeting? And any thoughts one way or another as potential viewers into the future?
You mean the Q&A that we haven't done yet?
No. The,
what
the
we just did.
questions and discussion that we've had in this you know,
Oh, yeah.
forum here.
It might be worth adding those to it as long as you're doing the video of Ken doing it. The follow-up, I think, would be good too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would
Okay.
agree.
Okay.
And if I could, oh, sorry, Paul.
Oh, no.
No, I just wanted to make one last plug for the climate change at lspa.org. You know, please, any questions that come up after we're done here, or if you're in conversations with your, you know, colleagues and they have additional questions, it's climate change at lspa.org to send them in to us.
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.